Hello, my name is David Bateman, and I'm Associate Professor in the Government Department at Cornell. I want to thank you all for joining us, the third Price event of 2021. It's also the third event in the Belknap Family Lefebvre Lowy Presidential Forum. Earlier events included a conversation with Bill Clinton, organized by the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, and a Price-organized event shortly after the election that focused on women of color and the future of US democracy. We encourage you all to tweet about tonight's event at hashtag first 100 days, and to follow us at Price Initiative on Twitter. You can see this on the slide, and we'll sort of remind you of this occasionally during the course of the discussion today. We also invite you to subscribe to our newsletter and to check out our website at priceinitiative.org for upcoming events. Since FDR, the 100-day mark of a president's first term has sort of stood as a marker for evaluating what a new administration has accomplished, as well for reflecting on some of the developing patterns that might come to define it. At Price, we wanted to use the 100 days as an opportunity to reflect on, in particular, on immigration and racial justice. We have a wonderful panel of experts here today, and we're very much looking forward to the discussion. I wanted to start by introducing our moderator for the evening. Sergio Garcia-Rios is an assistant professor in the government department at Cornell. He's a nationally recognized expert on Latino politics and immigrant identity formation. He was also polling director for Univision during the election, which from all accounts must have been crazy and a lot of work. I can't imagine anyone who's been better suited for leading this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. Sergio, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you everyone who's joining us for this very important and interesting conversation. I'll begin by introducing our panelists today. We have a great panel, and we're excited to have them joining us today. I'll start with in the order that I have in my screen for no particular reason other than that's how they appear on my screen. Naomi Carter is an associate professor at Howard University. She studies American politics with a focus on race, ethnic politics, Black politics, public opinion, and political behavior. Her book, American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship, was published by Harvard Oxford University. It's a great book investigating African American public opinion on immigration. Her work also extends to stuff like sanctuary cities, lynching and race in American politics, and political ideology of African American Republicans. She's published in multiple academic journals and multiple general audience outlets as well. Welcome and thank you, Naomi Carter. Deepak Bhargava is a distinguished lecturer at County School for Labor and Urban Studies. He's a policy expert on issues of poverty, economic justice, racial equality, and immigration, and has extensive practical experience in community organizing, leadership development, social movements, progressive strategy, issue campaigns, coalition building, and voter mobilization. He was also the president and executive director for Community Change and Community Change Action. And he also has a recent book on immigration, Immigration Matters. It's an edited volume, co-authored by him and other folks, Immigration Matter, Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future. And I'm told there's our next panelist also has a chapter in this book. And so Cecilia Munoz, who's a public policy and political advisor, she served as the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council under President Obama. She was actually the first Hispanic to serve as the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. She was also the policy and advisor for NCLU, now Unidos US, and also a senior advisor for New America. Her most recent book, More Than Ready, investigates, it's an insight into tactical tools women of color need to be successful without compromising who they are. So with that, I welcome all of our panelists. Thank you for being here. So I want to begin with a somewhat unrelated topic and piece of news that we received in the last couple of weeks, or the last week to be more precise, and that is the count in the census, which revealed that apparently population in the US is declining or slowing the pace that they were expecting. Many things have been argued. Maybe there was an undercount. I'm sure there was some of it. But other than that, what we have seen, and I think it's a big factor, is the slowdown of immigration. Yet, immigration continues to be front and center in the political debate. We see this year after year. I have seen this since I came to this country in the early 2000s. And I know this has been the case from many, many years back, way back to the founding of this country. Immigration is a central piece of what this country is or plans to be. Yet, we haven't solved the so-called immigration issue. And we have different takes. We have different ideologies, different strategies, and every president certainly faces this country in a different way. So this has been a very peculiar year. We haven't had a year like this. It's historic. And there are many challenges that the Biden administration is facing. So one of those is definitely immigration, but there are unique challenges attached to this: immigration and racial justice. How do we make sense? And I'll open with this sort of broad conversation with all three panelists. How do we make sense of the unique challenges that Biden is facing after everything that we have lived, including the Trump administration, including the pandemic, including declining immigration, all of these challenges? How do we make sense of the challenges that Biden will face in addressing immigration and racial justice? And so I'll make that open question. And so if I guess I can open again in the order that I have on my screen. I can start with Naomi Carter just to hear general thoughts.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me to participate. This is a great event, and I'm happy to be here. And I think there's, this is a really complicated set of questions, right? So you started framing this with the census, and I think, when we think about what the census does and sort of the political work that document does, I think it is reason for us to be rethinking again who we are trying to be, where we are trying to go, and what we think can be accomplished here beyond just sort of the reapportionment questions. On the other side of that are actual people. And right now we have a country that is in turmoil. Not that it's never been. I would just say we've been in turmoil since it became a thing that we call the United States. But I think perhaps how I was thinking about this question and where I see this is that part of the issue is that for me, we treat racial justice and immigration as separate issues, as if immigration is not a racial issue. Immigration to this country has always been racialized. Whether we were talking about the only people that were able to come here were, free white people, and then we had to decide what kind of white people, then we had to decide what kind of brown people and other kinds of people get to come here. So immigration has always been a racial issue. And I think treating them as sort of separate fights is how we sort of often get into these kinds of questions around, well, if we do something here, does that mean that takes attention away from there? And I think instead of an either or approach, we need a both and approach to these questions, because exclusion based on perceived difference happens to all kinds of people. And citizenship as a metric of belonging is a very flimsy way of measuring how well somebody will do and how well this country will receive them and treat them. And we've had abundant examples of this. I think what's pushing us to think about it now is that we have a pandemic on top of these events of last summer with the murder of George Floyd, but also the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. And then at the conclusion, right, I mean, it's been a really strange year in some ways, right? At the conclusion of all of this, the capper with the Chauvin trial was the murder of young Ma'Khia Bryant and Daunte Wright and Adam Toledo, all in this sort of same moment. And I think if anything is saying to me is that we have to think about, or perhaps even change our mind about who we consider to be a citizen and who we consider to be a foreigner. Because I argue that there are many people in this country who technically are citizens by administrative and birthright, but are not actual citizens in terms of having the freedom and the ability. And so I think of these as sort of twin kinds of discussions, not separate discussions. And I think if we're perhaps forecasting or thinking ahead with this particular administration, I mean, this isn't the first time a person had to manage racial issues and a pandemic, right? It's been a while, but it's not the first time it's happened. And I think Joe Biden just happened to come in at this moment, but at least it seems that there is a tension in this moment, and not just tension. And I think he's going to have these sort of, I don't know, it's either going to be a great position or a terrible position to be in, with sort of all eyes on him, because many of our lives are just in a different place now than they were before he took office. So that's sort of my brainstorming around that question.
Thank you. So, can follow. Would anyone else like to follow on that question, or I'm happy to pick someone. Cecilia, yes.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in. Sergio, also thank you so much for having me on this panel with these wonderful other additional panelists. You know, it resonated with me a lot that you started with the census, because one of the things that should be informing the immigration debate, which really isn't informing the immigration debate, is how it relates to what's happening with population in the United States. That if we want to continue to have economic growth, one of the roles that immigration has served has been to create an engine for that kind of economic growth. And we don't really acknowledge that in the immigration debate, but it is absolutely true. And that really highlights one of the big challenges that faces any administration that works on these issues. And that is that, like, at some level, the minute you start talking about immigration in a policy context, it's like you enter a fact-free zone, right? It's very heavy on emotion, not particularly heavy or reliant on data. The economic data on the benefits of immigrants is very clear, but it's not particularly well understood in the policy context or understood really across the country. So, you know, you end up with an issue that is really easily exploited for emotional reasons, for good or for ill, but which isn't necessarily, where the debate isn't necessarily based on the facts. And that has really hindered our ability to just update our laws, right? The legal immigration system hasn't been reformed for 30 years, right? Google didn't exist the last time immigration was reformed. Email was kind of new the last time the immigration system was reformed, to just give you a feel of like how outdated it is. And we end up having these debates which are focusing on revving up emotions and not necessarily just laying out what's in our national interest. How would it best serve the people of the country, the families of the country, and the country who want to reunite? If we simply updated our system, if we you know, finally did the work of making sure that the millions of people who were here without immigration status had the opportunity to get on the legal side of the ledger. And, you know, to engage in the much harder question, which is, I think, right in front of the Biden administration, in part for the reasons that Niambi just outlined, which is that we're in a moment where we are seeing a little more clearly the challenges of racial injustice and racial equity in our country. This is absolutely related to our immigration debate. We tend not to acknowledge it, but it's true. You know, an administration which has made the kind of commitments that the Biden administration has made on racial equity, you know, will have a challenge in addressing those issues, but it is long, long past time to do it.
Thank you. Deepak, if you want to have any thoughts on this sort of broad question.
Yeah, thank you also so much for hosting this important discussion, and thank you to my brilliant panelists. I agree with everything they just said. So I think the unavoidable backdrop here for what Biden faces is that we are still in the middle of an extraordinary threat to our democracy. The authoritarian threats have not receded. They are still very much present, and they're powered by racism and nativism. That has been really the fuel, the engine. It's been the vehicle for the attacks on our democracy that we've seen. And whether it's the rise of white nationalist groups or hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans, or the insurrection on January 6th, which is really not that long ago at the Capitol, all of that comes out of this very long history and stew of racism and nativism. And so I think from my perspective, dealing with the underlying root evils that have brought us to this place is now not just a matter of another policy issue. it's actually a matter of saving our democracy, dealing with having a real racial reckoning in this country, and also undertaking long overdue immigration reforms. And I think one of the dilemmas of the kind of avoidance of issues of immigration over the last 30 years is that all the old problems are still there. We need to legalize 11 million undocumented people and so forth, but a whole new set of problems have emerged. And so what we're seeing now is waves of climate migration that are really posing a question to this country. The people in Central America did not cause global warming. They are the victims of it, and the United States and the global North are largely to blame for this problem. What is now our obligation to meet the challenge of millions of people who are being displaced by extreme weather and desertification and crop failures? What are our obligations to do that? So we now have a kind of new massive set of issues about future migration that are also presenting themselves to the Biden administration in this in these early few months.
Thank you all. So very interesting thoughts, and I a couple of so many interesting things here. Was sort of thinking about immigration beyond what we normally think of, and the way that our panelists have framed it. It's immigration not only an economic or labor issue, but really a racial issue. And as Cecilia mentioned, also it's an issue that is heavy on emotion, but it goes beyond that. And so the reality is that for any change, substantive change to happen, we'll need legislation. And legislation is not that easy. And we'll need to talk about sort of the incentives that are out there, or whether they're not. And so I'm wondering whether, in thinking about the possibility of immigration even just happening, whether there's an incentive on the legislative side, whether there's cooperation, whether that can happen. And for that, I'm thinking about public sentiment. What do we think about this? In the middle of, well, obviously, as was mentioned, now we're seeing that immigration is also a racial issue, but racial issues are emerging, and not that they didn't exist before, but they were becoming aware of those. And so where do we fit this challenge of creating legislation and reform in the middle of what seems to be an awakening for all sort of Americans? And maybe Niambi can tell us more about that.
Well, I'll let Cecilia go first, and I'll chime in after.
Thank you. I think immigration is one of, frankly, many issues that the Biden administration is confronting, where there is a big divergence between where public sentiment is and where the Congress of the United States is, right? We have known for years, and this continues to be true, that the vast majority of the American public supports the kind of immigration reform which has been on the table periodically for going on 20 years now. Right, one which creates a legalization process for the undocumented immigrants, which updates our legal immigration system to make it easier for families to reunite, which updates our asylum system and other systems so that they are, again, more effective, more efficient, more orderly. I think the thing we have known for a long time is that the American people are prepared to support a generous immigration policy, provided that they believe, are persuaded that it's going to be orderly, that it's going to be fair, that it's going to be humane. That is all widely supported by the vast majority of the American public. So our problem is not really in public sentiment, and our problem isn't really in the policy debate. There's the road has been well trodden with respect to what the policy should be. There tends to be quite a bit of consensus about what the policies need to be. Our problem is really a political problem, in that the Congress, and really on the Republican side of the aisle especially, does not reflect the will of the American people. And you've seen the Biden administration make this point on a number of policies, right? That he's being accused of not being bipartisan, and the rejoinder is, well, it depends on what you mean by bipartisan. If you mean putting forward proposals that Democrats and Republicans support, in the case of immigration and many other things, that's true of where the current administration is. It's just not bipartisan because the Republicans in Congress won't support it. And that is really the big obstacle.
And I think following what Cecilia said is, I think the popular conception, or the one that we get fed a lot, is that there's so much hostility to immigrants, and that just doesn't seem to bear out. In particular, I look at African-American opinion, and African-Americans tend to be the most liberal when it comes to these kinds of policies. And I think part of our misunderstanding of that, and it's been confirmed by Pew, the collaborative multiracial politics study, and a field poll from about 8 years ago, that this is not going to be a controversial issue. I think what will be controversial is how people approach the issue, and whether people think they can score political points with people's lives. And it is very easy, if you look at Twitter or you look at some other sources where it seems like Black communities would be opposed to this, but that's not the case. What people are really opposed to is a policy that would, say, make them unemployable. I think most people would be opposed to that. But it becomes very easy, right, when we have these conversations, particularly when we talk about the economics of this, right, for immigrants to become the face of unemployment, or the reason for your unemployment, right? Not these larger systems of exploitation that work to keep all communities, right, oppressed, underpaid, unemployed, right? And those are the kinds of conversations I think, if we are thoughtful about, and we actually have, then we can actually do some things. I mean, certainly the case is that for a very long time, people know that keeping people undocumented endangers their lives, right? And it makes everyone's life less safe, right? Because those same communities where undocumented people may live are other communities of color, other Black people, other Latino people who are having their communities surveilled, who are having those communities be raided by police and other things. And that makes everybody open up to more incarceration and all kinds of things. So I would say that, moving toward immigration reform, if it's pitched right, can be something that we can do. And Deepak was exactly right when he talked about sort of nativism being this sort of bottomless well of political incentive, right? You can really mine that well for a lot of things. And it reminds me of what Lyndon Johnson said, right? If you can sort of convince a poor white that he's better than that Black person, you can pick his pocket all day. And I think that's what happens here, that people are convinced that immigrants are the problem, and that's not the problem. And I think it's also important to remember when we talk about African Americans in particular, but just other communities, that immigration reform in 1965 came right along with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And we have to think about those things as all being joined together. It is a long standing case that there were cross-community solidarities, and this issue is no different. I just think we talk about it as if immigration reform is an Asian issue or it's a Latino issue. We forget that it's an all of us issue. It's a Black people issue. There are Black DACA recipients. There are Black people at the southern border right now. There are Black people that are being deported, with the replication of TPS for Haitians and other communities. So the very same things that are affecting those communities are also affecting communities that are identified as Black, even though we don't necessarily talk about it so much.
I so agree with those comments from Niambi, and I just add, I think the backdrop here is that there's the new data that shows that 70% of Republicans don't believe that Joe Biden won the election last November. So we are in a kind of grotesque spiral of escalation of radicalization between one of the country's major political parties and a very substantial portion of the population. And I think what that means, candidly, for legislation is that it's hard to imagine 10 Republicans joining with 50 Democrats to pass a bipartisan bill in this kind of polarized environment on immigration. However, I think there is an opportunity for Democrats to pursue legalizing, providing a path to citizenship for essential workers, for dreamers, for TPS holders, for farm workers in the context of the American Jobs Act. And I hope they will prioritize it. So that's kind of the tactical issue, I think, that's at hand for Democrats in the face of this like implacable Republican racism and nativism. The kind of bigger picture philosophical question is, do you lean in to deal with the racism and nativism, or do you kind of step back? And I think that is really a big question. So there's huge challenges facing the country, the COVID-19 crisis, the economic crisis, and so forth. But I would argue that it's imperative for the Biden administration to lean right in on race and immigration, not to think, oh, that's the tough stuff, you know, like we can't deal with that, so we're going to work on the stuff that unifies us, because that is actually the engine that prevents us from getting the so-called unifying stuff done. So I hope there's really an effort to prioritize dealing with racial justice and these immigration issues that have been put off too long, because unless there's not, I think we're just going to see this fire on the other side continue to escalate.
This is great. I find it sort of, you know, I find hope in hearing all of this, but yet the reality is that it seems like it might be very challenging. And one of the challenges in this sort of environment that you have mentioned as the environment of nativism and the environment of using immigration as this continuous sort of well of rhetoric against immigration that sort of translates to many other areas. We hear the news, and I'm always surprised to hear the way that news characterized what's happening at the southern border, and have, you know, a big connection with the border. My family, I have family on both sides of the border, and so I go there often, and I know how things look like. But that's not what I see on TV. That's not what I see, and across all the spectrum, right? And so, characterized in all outlets, right, from right to left. We hear we hear the as a surge, as a big issue, as a problem, and the reality is that this is cyclical, and we have seen it year after year, and so we have seen it before, and it has been dealt with again in different ways, and certainly the Trump administration had to deal with this, and Obama administration had to deal with this. So this gets me to think about two things. How can the Biden administration sort of handle this surge, right? It's as they're calling it, and you know, what seems to be a cyclical matter. How can they handle this that can be different or maybe similar to other administrations? And is there really a way out? And should really even be looking for a way out? And in that same vein, is this what we're seeing fuel, and are we seeing really that this is going to be used to get on the way of reform?
So, you know, I think this is to not use the term, this is a hard one. But I mean, I think, you know, one of the things we know does not work is what we've been doing, which is tearing families apart and doing all of this stuff. That is not working. And now we are dealing with children, right? In this sort of southern border moment. That's been a lot of the conversation, and a lot of concern is the fact that you have unaccompanied minors. And that's a delicate situation, because you're still talking about young people who are developing and all the things, and the government is putting itself in the position of kind of caring for these children. And I don't know that we want them to be doing that job, because they clearly don't do a good job of that. But I think one of the things that, you know, Deepak mentioned earlier that we've really not done yet is really talk about, why are people coming in the first place? This is not what people would rather be doing. Nobody wants to risk their health and their safety. None of these children want to be here. None of these parents want to be here. And when we're not talking about, you know, global warming and the intended effects of natural disasters, when we're not talking about the sort of economic issues, when we're not talking about the political instability in people's home countries and other things that make that preferable, because that is a hard road and nobody takes that lightly. I think when we leave that out of the conversation, we are really short-circuiting, I think, our possibility for being innovative here, right? Because what America knows to do and what America likes to do is incarcerate her problems, right? Whether we're talking about migrants, or we're talking about, you know, poor people or the mentally ill and others in the United States, America knows how to lock up her problems. What America's not thought about thoughtfully or carefully enough is how do we deal with the fact that these are human beings? These are people who are entitled, quite frankly, to all that that means, the dignity of that. And instead of, I think, trying to get back to these root causes, it's, well, we'll detain them, maybe we'll do something else. But there's really not been, to Cecilia's earlier point, any real innovation or intervention in the way we have thought about this. And one of the things that, I mean, we know we don't have enough of our immigration courts, for example. We don't have enough. That is probably one of the most under-resourced parts of this body. We don't have enough, I think, people who are in these positions, and I'm not suggesting this is unique to the Biden administration. I think we think every administration is just going to change the last 40, 50, 100 years of policy in 100 days. But we've not had a real sensibility about how you do this and what our responsibility is in this, right? I mean, there's lots of platitudes and all these kinds of things, but not real sense of how to do that. And I don't think it's helped, quite frankly, for the Biden administration to sort of flip-flopped around this issue of how many, say, refugees they were going to allow in and that kind of thing. I don't think those kinds of uncertainties are helping the situation. So this was a sort of roundabout way of saying, I don't know, right? But I know what we're doing isn't working.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here. I mean, your point, Sergio, that what's happening at the border is a cyclical problem, cyclical challenge, is true, but at the same time, it's happening on a scale that's unprecedented, and that's also true. And Niambi's point, which I completely agree with, which is that we don't have enough resources in the immigration courts, is also true. I also wonder, given the scale of the problem, whether it's possible to have enough resources in the immigration courts to fully deal with this challenge and fully adjudicate through our current system all of the asylum petitions, which are now coming forward. And right, the thing which is drawing the public attention and frankly the media feeding frenzy is unaccompanied migrant children. I worked on this challenge when I was in government. The average age of the children who were coming either alone or with smugglers was 14. I met some as young as 7. Think of, you know, and to the point of, you know, this is not the choice that folks want to make. Imagine the decision to put your child, your 7-year-old, in the hands of a smuggler. About 80% of the kids who were coming, again, this was in 2014, which was at the height of the challenge in the Obama years, about 80% of those kids had a parent in the United States. Now, if we had passed the same immigration reform that we're effectively talking about now, back in 2006, which is the first time that it passed the Senate, those parents would be legal residents and would be using the legal immigration system to bring their children north, and you would not have the smuggling problem. You would not have what we're seeing at the border nearly on the scale that we're seeing now. So in some ways, we're experiencing the results of our failure, of Congress's failure to do its job. That is at least a piece of what we're seeing now. I have been shocked to hear policymakers on both sides of the aisle question whether the United States should be accepting unaccompanied migrant kids, as if somehow the right choice would be to just leave them to their own devices in Mexico. The way that system works is that they are sheltered by Department of Health and Human Services. They're taken out of the Border Patrol's hands because Border Patrol facilities are not suitable for kids. HHS operates shelters, but the purpose of those shelters is to house the kids properly while they are finding their family members to reunite them, right? Which is I think the right role for the government. But fair point on whether or not they do it well. But the larger question is whether or not, and I think the Biden administration has begun to answer this question, whether or not we actually get real about the fact that we have a refugee crisis in our hemisphere. That's really what's happening here. It's being driven by violence, but it's also being driven, as Deepak says, by climate change. There is a drought in Guatemala. Honduras got hit by 2 huge hurricanes in the course of 2 weeks. Some of the people who are coming because their homes are underwater. So we both have urgent humanitarian needs to address in the region. The Biden administration is reinstating the policy that the Obama administration started of providing a mechanism for people in the region to seek safety without having to come all the way north and cross all of Mexico to get to safety. So there's both the need for refugee processing in the region. There is the need to get other countries involved in providing protection and safe haven for folks who are fleeing for a variety of reasons. And this is really, and of course, Vice President Harris has been asked by the president to lead the charge in working with the Northern Triangle countries, which are the sending countries in this case, to begin to deal with the reasons that people are migrating in the first place. That is the beginning of the strategy that we need for what is coming, which is climate migration, not just in our hemisphere, but globally. And so the conversation that we really need to be having, I mean, we need to have a conversation about how to make sure our asylum procedures are fair and well adjudicated and get to the right answer much more quickly than they do now. But we also desperately need a conversation about what countries in the global north are going to do to address the climate migration which is coming, because our asylum system is not going to be what addresses this problem. And while we do need to reform it and we need to update it, we need a much more robust response to the displacement which is coming.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think you can see this playing out all over the world, this cycle, right? So there are people dying in the Mediterranean Sea who are fleeing the desertification, essentially, of Africa, who are often being left to boats are capsizing and people are not being rescued. We have thousands of people who are migrating from Central America, enduring unbelievable trauma, right? Death and all kinds of unbelievably horrible things. In India, we have people fleeing Bangladesh, coming to West Bengal, who are being given instructions by the Indian government has given instructions to shoot people on sight who are fleeing flooding lands, right? So this is kind of our, and there's like a lose-lose version of this scenario, which is armed fortifications and walls, and that will poison, that will not just hurt migrants, that will inevitably poison, as Niambi said, for all the reasons of American history, that will poison our domestic culture. It will mean our politics is toxic. There is no democracy in a situation where that is what's happening at its edges. There just can't be. And so the question is how to have a real conversation about these root causes of poverty and the history of US foreign policy, which goes way, way back in these regions, and above all about climate change. There's a win-win version of this scenario, which goes back to where you started, which is about helping people who, where we can, stay where they are in place and thrive, and then recognizing that we have a moral obligation as a country to welcome many, many more people than we currently do, and that our economy actually over the long term needs that. That all of the Western countries are suffering from projections of significant declines in the ratio of workers to retirees. And the census data that you referred to at the beginning show, we had the lowest population growth of any decade since 1790, except for the Great Depression. It's unsustainable from an economic point of view. So there is a win-win version, but it will require public leadership on a scale we have not yet seen. And it will require pointing the blame in a very different direction. So if right-wing parties are weaponizing nativism and racism to point the finger at people of color and immigrants, there's a different story here, which is that the economic policies of this last generation have pitted people against each other, have degraded work. We can do this differently. It is absolutely within our capacity to do this. And that, I think, is going to be one of the big social justice challenges of our time, is to get to that deeper, real story about why people are in the crises there are here in the United States and abroad, because it's the same story.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I completely agree with this moral argument, and obviously I can see it. And I don't mean to be pessimistic here, but you know, the moral argument is clear to me, and many others. It doesn't seem to play out, and there's to me one clear example with where it seems like the moral argument and sort of like the make sense type of policy doesn't work, and that is DACA, which, you know, has had support for the most part, and it's evolved actually to have a broad support. Yet we don't really see it happening, and we don't see DACA transitioning from an executive action to, or maybe it is, to an actual permanent policy. And so it seems like that's another, you know, if we're to be concerned about people, you know, this asylum and refugee crisis that we have, we should also be concerned, it seems to me, about those that are already here, that have lived here their whole lives, who, you know, we're talking about 7-year-old migrating, and maybe not on their own, but migrating, and they know no other country. This is their country for all we know, and yet we don't see any sort of firm position in terms of policy. The Biden administration has proposed that they're going to solve this and they're going to take care of this, and they actually suggested that they were going to do that in the first 100 days. They did by just basically reinstating what we had. I said, can we really think about one, DACA being placed as a permanent policy, and maybe can we think about where else can we go, or can we, with this divide, can we just expect more executive actions? And so as I ask this question and I open up to the panelists, I want to remind the audience to start asking questions in the Q&A. We'll have questions from the audience towards the end, and so please feel free to start sending your questions. And so to the panelists.
So I'll dive in a little bit on DACA, but I'm sure my other panelists will have more to say. It is, of course, imperative for Congress to do its job, right? The DREAM Act has been pending. It was first proposed. It's been 20 years we've been working on the DREAM Act. Again, huge support across the country. It's passed the House of Representatives. It, you know, nearly passed the Senate in 2010. There were 11 Republicans in the Senate who had voted for it previously. Some were the original sponsors of the DREAM Act. We didn't need all of them. We needed 8. We got 3, and that's why the DREAM Act is not law. And you know, it's an open question right now. The maneuvering is going on in Congress, even as we speak, about whether or not it can get 60 votes, whether or not it will move on a reconciliation. These are all questions of the moment. And it's, you know, it's another example of the disconnect, right? That here's a thing which the country is for, but it's not clear whether or not the Congress is going to be able to do it. But it's the other thing which is true about DACA, which is something as an Obama alum I'm very proud of, is that it is the result of changes in enforcement policy. It is, you know, the much has been made of President Obama's resisting doing this. And the reason that he was resisting doing it was because his preference was for Congress to act, because a congressional action is permanent, and action by the executive, as we now richly know, is not. And the DACA recipients continue to be at risk as the litigation against DACA continues to work its way through the courts. And, you know, it's not impossible that the unthinkable happen, making DACA recipients vulnerable again. And that's, again, it's unthinkable, but it is not impossible. All of which points to the necessity for Congress to do its job. And I will say that if we do reach, God forbid, the day when we get a bad court, you know, another bad court decision on DACA, I fear that much of the advocacy pressure will focus on President Biden to wave another administrative magic wand, which he doesn't have. And as opposed to pressure on the Congress to do what it needs to do. And that's, I can't state strongly enough how urgent it is for Congress to step up and get this done, because it is very much at risk, and because the administrative tools available to the president are not great. And, you know, as President Obama said the day he announced DACA, these are people who deserve better than to live their lives in 2-year increments.
Yeah, let me add to that, I think the resolution of this, the crisis around DACA and around immigration, really is unfolding in front of our eyes, and that is the political mobilization of communities of color. So it was not that long ago that California was the home to nativist politics in our country. It has been transformed in a generation, not by magic, but by sustained organization by community groups, by labor unions, by immigrant rights organizations to change that politics. You know, the work in Georgia by African Americans and other people of color has completely altered the map. The work in Arizona, in Nevada, it happened. It's like the backlash to the white backlash. That is actually what gives me a tremendous amount of hope about the future. Is I think that process, which involves mobilization among particular groups of color and alliance building between them in response to this wave of racism and nativism, is the greatest source of strength for the change. Now, it may not unfold immediately or quickly, but it is unfolding, and it needs to be supported. And that's what's going to drive, I think of policy as kind of reflecting underlying power relationships in society. And so there's been a resurgence of white nationalism and white power politics, and the Republican Party is the vehicle for it. But a counter mobilization is also underway. There is like an active struggle going on. And I have great hope that there's a possibility that through sustained action, this can be broken and we can really see a major breakthrough. And I think to Niambi's earlier point, the fortunes of communities of color generally go together, right? When Reconstruction failed, we soon got the Chinese Exclusion Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1965 Immigration Act, as she said. And so to me, the movement for Black lives, the immigrant rights movement, the movements of communities of color working together, including but not limited to politics, is a crucial way to break this logjam that we're in.
And as a political scientist, I know exactly what you're getting to, Sergio. So I'm going to indulge your cynicism here, right? Because, you know, the things that we're talking about, right? I mean, I think these are, like you said, these are all things that most Americans appreciate, but it's sort of like what we saw with the Affordable Care Act. People really liked it, but they hated Obamacare. Same thing. But these sort of rhetorical flourishes matter. So calling children at the southern border a tidal wave, right? Referring to these people as terrorists or terrorist adjacent, right? That doing this, so locking up children, separating families is equated with making us safe, gets people to throw away all of the things that they know are right and true about the world, even the things that they believe in. And we know we can't give people enough facts. This is not a fact issue. More information doesn't change people's minds. And I think, you know, and this is to, you know, Cecilia's earlier point, that ginning up all of these feelings, all of these fears, particularly post September 11th, really makes people, I think, ignore the human side of this and ignore their gut. I mean, you and I know that most of the people who are new entrants to the country, particularly those who are coming this way, right? We're not talking about the mega rich. We're not talking about the super educated. We are talking about people who had no choice in many of these cases that we're discussing. They're not competing with the average American citizen for a job, right? They're not even in the same industries by and large, but it still matters to people to think that they are holding on to something that these other people can't get. And when we talk about these people as rapists, when we say these criminals, when we say they're lawless, right? I mean, all of that stuff makes people sort of back away from something that is a very common sense issue, right? If you want people to live lives that keep all of us safe, that keep them safe, it would seem like you would prioritize giving them an option as opposed to pushing people to the shadows, pushing people in very dangerous positions. I mean, heck, it would even say, hey guys, maybe we need to rethink these gas guzzlers that we're driving. If we really care about keeping this country safe, right? And by this way, I mean, safe from other people coming in, it would seem you would say like this climate change thing might be something we need to think more seriously about if we want to stop this, right? Because as Deepak says, the world's resources are getting smaller, not larger. And so, you know, all of this is to say, people are not motivated by facts. People are now being motivated by feelings. And I think in particular for Republicans, even though, you know, Democrats, you know, Joe Manchin and others, you know, play around on this issue as well, know that allowing these people into the country is likely going to change the electorate. And in some very important places like Texas, Arizona, right? All of these places that matter a whole lot to them. And they don't want to potentially lock themselves out of these national elections. At least that's my thought. Now, I would say also, if I'm being totally political here, let those people come in and say, you know what? Those Republicans were really good to me and my family. They let me come here. I want to vote for them. Now, that's another way to play it because their share of the constituency is not growing. It's shrinking. They can't win national elections by popular vote anymore. They've been winning on electoral votes. So, but that's not the way that they want to go. They want to speak to an increasingly smaller base. And we know that the world isn't becoming whiter, right? This country isn't becoming whiter either. And so if I was on the right, that would be the play that I would make. But that's not the play that they want to make because they're still invested in an image of this country that does not exist. It never existed, quite frankly. And it is a sad thing to see because they're playing football with people's actual lives. And that to me is abhorrent.
And that, if I can jump in, I 100% agree with that. And it really raises the question of race in this debate, which is, you know, it's not like it's new that, you know, folks, particularly on the anti-immigrant side, have kind of wielded race. It's been coded a lot, although not recently. It wasn't particularly coded in the last 4 years. And I'm making an educated guess that I am possibly by far the oldest member of this panel, but I've been in the immigrants' rights world for 30 years. And in the 90s, our kind of communications training focused on like, look, we all know race is a factor here, but if you want to get people on your side, don't be calling them racist. Don't be calling out the racism in this debate because they will hear you calling them racist. So don't do that, which I understand as a messaging technique, but I also think it ill prepared us for the moment that we are, not just that we have been living through, but that we are still living through. It's not like it's over. I mean, the organized anti-immigrant lobby, and there is one, is a collection of groups, all of which have ties to white supremacy, all of them. This has been known and visible for 40 years. And yet the media still turns to them for quotes for articles. Their materials still get used by members of Congress in order to, you know, shape their talking points and their amendments when immigration bills are up for consideration. You know, I used to have to tell reporters who were asking me to debate these guys on television and other places, like it's maybe inappropriate for me to be debating somebody who's working for an organization with ties to white supremacy, and lost that argument every time. We are now living in a moment where it's a little more clear and it's a little better understood that this is what's going on. You know, you don't want to take joy in feeling vindicated after saying it for 30 years and to suddenly have the mainstream media discover that there's some white supremacy involved in this debate. But it's true, and it's now like unmasked. And we have to address it, right? It's a tool being used in the most cynical and ugly way now at the very highest levels of our politics. And it is being aided and abetted in the media. And it runs the risk of undercutting everything we aspire to be as a country. And, as Deepak puts it, it's, what's at issue here, the thing that we're ultimately fighting for is, like, I really believe this, is the future of multiracial democracy on the planet. Like, if it's not going to work here, if we can't make it work here, it's hard for me to believe that it would happen anywhere, that it's possible anywhere. That is really what this is. It's obviously not just the immigration debate, and as both of my fellow panelists have said, all of these issues are intertwined, but we do have to understand and accept that in all of these debates, the enemy here is white supremacy. And there's some things which are just should not be repeated, should not be aided and abetted, should not be driving congressional action, not for another minute.
So this is very powerful and both sad and also real, that we need to sort of really know where we are. And I can see sort of that other extreme and that other side of nativists and white supremacists that really are against immigration. And if I'm able to sort of bring it back a little more to kind of like the official versions of what happens in Congress, right? There seems, at least the narrative that we hear is that there seems to be a kind of a balance that administrations have to do, right? On the one hand, anything that happens in relation to immigration has to be sort of taking care of both aspects, right? On the one hand, immigrants, and then on the other hand, borders. And so restricting borders, and then at the same time creating solutions. And so that balance shifts from one administration to another. So as you know, I've been very involved with polling through Univision, and we recently polled purposely this very interesting survey, sort of self-advertising here, but it was an interesting survey of new communities. So places where we usually don't find immigrants, but that we know they're there and that they're growing. And so we asked them many things, COVID-related questions, many things, and we asked them about sort of what they thought about their immigration status and the Biden administration. And one thing that we kept hearing, and this is sort of the version that many people sort of have, and so I wanted to hear your thoughts on this, right? Is it true that we need that balance, right? That we need to enforce the borders, sort of reinforce the borders and enforce deportation so that we can have a true, real sort of immigration reform? And to add, which is one more question to that, given that if we need to have that balance, and even if we don't, how far can we really expect to go in terms of an immigration reform?
So let me just first say bravo to Cecilia for her last comments, because she spoke to my spirit. But, I think this is part of the problem, I see at least, is that one of the things we've not done, or to Cecilia's point, that we have had an issue with, especially over this last 20 years since 9/11, is putting terrorism and immigration together, right? And making this claim that all of this border security, whether it be a wall or increasing border patrols, is making us safer somehow. And really all we've shown is that it's making the lives of the people at the border more endangered, right? It's really not served much of a purpose. It certainly hasn't made us safer. It didn't keep us from the January 6th insurrection, which I argue was a terrorist event. And certainly our national intelligence community say that's our biggest threat. And I think, we can go far. I mean, there's nothing to suggest that we have to treat our borders this way. The reason we treat the southern border the way we do is because of Chinese exclusion, right? That was an attempt to keep other kinds of people away. And that's why that border is so contentious, because let's be clear, we don't feel this way about Canada. Nobody is arguing about that large, unprotected border that we have with our neighbors to the north. This is about the color of the people we think are coming and who we think we are as a nation. And unfortunately, all signs point to the powers that be, in many cases, not necessarily this president or this administration, think America is still a white nation, and white in the traditional white, right? You know, Anglo-Saxon, who had this story about how we came to be. It ignores indigenous people, right? It ignores African people. It ignores all kinds of people who contributed to this place, right? You know, let the story tell it, you know, the way it goes. Mexico, that's just some other place. It ignores the whole story of how that border came to be, right? And ignores the people who were already living there. So I think we can probably go a lot farther if we actually had a Congress that was going to do its job, in particular, a Senate that was going to do its job. I mean, we witnessed a Senate that abdicated its responsibility to this country over and over again. I mean, I don't know many positions you can just call and say, I'm not going to do my job. But for the Senate in particular, this has been a common refrain in a way to, again, look tough, score political points, suggest to people that you're sort of holding the line. And so we do see a lot of divides, and those divides are largely partisan. Those divides are also very racialized. And I think we have to recognize that. And unfortunately, I think with the moment that we have in the political climate that we are in, we won't know how far reform can go because we won't even do the most basic things. DACA is not hard. I think most people understand why children. I mean, if you look at the civil rights movement, you start with children because it's like, who is more sympathetic than a child? But even there, we again have a Congress that's saying, no, we are not going to do this, right? A Senate that's saying, we're not going to do this. And so, you know, I want to be hopeful, right? Because I just think that's the human thing. I think you always look for hope, and you always see the world is different than what it was, right? My world is different than the way my mom and my grandparents lived. So you know there can be progress, but we also know that people have to get out of the way. And, you know, part of it is waiting for legislation to happen that may or may not happen, but also trying to gather up the resources that we have in human form, right, to move these people out of the way of progress. And that's what's going to happen. Unfortunately, however, you know, they have some stalwart supporters who are very energized by this notion that they can change what is coming and what is already here in many instances, which is, you know, people who are not, who don't look like the founders, but who have otherwise contributed to this country, who are demanding, right, that this country live up to its alleged promises. And so, you know, I don't know how far we can go. I think the folks who've been working in this arena for a really long time have some great ideas about how to do it. You know, even just basic things like decriminalize being an undocumented person. That could be a very small thing to take this, you know, reform a little farther than we are right now.
Yeah, I applause for that. I completely agree. And I want to take this question of enforcement in light of the paradigm shift that the movement for Black Lives has really kind of forced the country to reckon with, because I think it should apply to the question of immigration. I think we need a completely different paradigm on how we think about enforcement. The national security state that's been built up since 9/11 has driven unbelievable harm and separation of families, and it's really terrorized communities, and it dampens participation, it dampens engagement in a very comparable way to the effect of mass incarceration and racist policing has, and it needs to be dismantled. We spend 36 times more on ICE than we do on ensuring that workers get paid the minimum wage, that law is enforced. we spend 57 times more on ICE than we do on civil rights enforcement at the Justice Department. 120 times more on ICE than civil rights enforcement at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Do you really want to tell me that undocumented farm workers and dreamers and everyday folks who care care for us as a country are that much more a threat to national security than people who don't pay their taxes or who violate civil rights laws or engage? It's like a crazy paradigm that we have, I think, now adopted without question. And I think we need to revisit it fundamentally and radically. So my view is the enforcement paradigm in this country, as it applies to Black and brown folks, is completely broken, and it needs to be challenged and interrogated. I think it's great that President Biden says we want to go after wealthy tax cheats. As an example, there's $700 billion over a decade that are not collected by the United States government by people who volitionally choose to evade our tax laws. But the risk of getting caught for doing that is infinitesimal. So we have a choice to make, a political choice, a moral choice that very much plays into this question of who is the country for. And right now we're doing the wrong thing.
And so I obviously completely agree with what both of my fellow panelists have said. And an interesting development is that the immigration bill, which President Biden put forward, is the first one which actually breaks from this paradigm. Like the way of doing this, at least since the 1986 immigration reform, could also have been true earlier, but I wasn't around for anything earlier than that. Is that if you're going to do something on the generous side, if you're going to propose to legalize people, then in order to get the votes, that something on the enforcement side has to happen. That's been sort of the balance that Congress has attempted to strike, at least since the 1986 immigration reforms. And the rationale for President Biden to break with that tradition and to propose a very generous legalization program with a very different model of enforcement, right there. So the standard model is more detention beds, more walls, more border personnel, is because the detention beds and the border wall and the additional border personnel all happened, right? Everything that got proposed in the early iterations of this same immigration reform bill got done between both Democratic and Republican administrations with the support of members of Congress and appropriations from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. So there was like nothing left to do in the sort of immigration enforcement architecture under the old model that Deepak just outlined. And so what President Biden's proposal does is propose a generous legalization process and border infrastructure, like at ports of entry, and technology to address the challenges of the border that we actually have and not the border that we had 30 years ago, which is what most of our legislative conversation has been about. So that's, I think, an important and interesting development. And it does beg the question of, I mean, look, I watched this deal get struck for the 2013 bill by Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, where in order to get the Republican votes that Senator Schumer was hoping for, Senators Corker and Hoeven basically came to him and said, whatever the number of Border Patrol officials we have is, let's double that. And that's what the Senate voted to put in the 2013 bill, right? So that's right now, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 officers, more than double what we had in the Bush administration. What the Senate of the United States voted to do in 2013 was to double that, not because there had been some kind of analysis proposed of what was needed, but because some members of the Senate felt like they needed to tell their constituents we're going to double what we're doing at the border. And I saw one calculation in the press that determined that if you actually could hire that number of officials to patrol the border and you could physically line them up along the border, they would be able to see each other, right? It's back to being a fact-free zone. Has nothing to do with the reality of what the challenges are that we actually face. When I say we shouldn't be trying to solve for the border we had 30 years ago, what I mean by that is our challenge used to be single adults coming from Mexico for economic reasons and seeking to evade our authorities. That's not the challenge we have now. In fact, net migration from Mexico has been below zero for a long time, meaning more Mexicans leave the US to go back to Mexico than Mexicans coming to the US. The challenge we face now is unaccompanied children and families with children coming from Central America, and they are not trying to evade our authorities. They are looking for our authorities so that they can ask for asylum, right? So no amount of walls, no amount of border guards is gonna help us address that problem. So the thing we have to insist on is a debate about the border we actually have, right? But the border has this kind of mystical symbolism, right? If it feels like it's out of control, it's a tool for some folks in the political sphere to scare Americans into thinking, like, this is what President Trump did for 4 years. Look at the crisis and vote for me because I'm making you look at the crisis. Had nothing to do with solving it. It had everything to do with cynicism and kind of exploiting something that isn't working very well. It's time to have a conversation about just making sure that it works. I think the American people are desperate for that. It's long past time. We haven't done this now for 30 years. It's really time.
Just to add one more thing to this point.
Very powerful, by the way. Like I'm very inspired, and so this is a great conversation. But go ahead, Deepak.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, if you think about what's happening, so the Republicans used to say we need these other billions of dollars on top of the billions we've spent, as Cecilia was saying, in order for us to support immigration reform. They now there's not even any amount of money, I think, that could persuade them to come to the table on that issue. The Republican Party once used to support the regular renewals of the Voting Rights Act. They are now in states around the country trying to essentially gut people of color's right to vote. So we have a party that's in full-scale revolt against 1965, right? Against the Voting Rights Act and against the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. They're in full-scale revolt against the browning of America and the political power of people of color. So to me, there's going to be a very important test in the months ahead, which is, will there be a successful effort to pass H.R. 1, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, immigration, these things that will require, will probably not get any support from Republicans. That will require eliminating filibuster that is itself steeped in slavery and our racial history. So we're kind of coming towards a moment where this battle is going to be joined in a very dramatic way. And I think a lot of our future depends on how that gets resolved.
Thank you. I'm going to provide some sort of, provide a space for final thoughts for all three of our panelists. And I'll make it also kind of an observation of what I think I've learned, which is so much that it will be hard to wrap up. And as I do that, I'll bring in some of the questions that we had left on the Q&A and that they were sent to me too. And so if there's a chance as you wrap up with your final comments, if you can sort of talk about this. So one thing that it seems urgent is, and what I've learned throughout this conversation, is the urgency of understanding immigration as a racial issue, and understand it as an issue of what this country is about, and as an issue of justice. And so those three things, sort of what the country is, a racial issue, and an issue of justice, will massively change sort of how we talk, how we think, and what we see in relation to immigration. It was inspiring to hear sort of this effort, and hearing sort of the in and outs from Cecilia is also, great that we get to hear this paradigm shift that's happening. I remain a little skeptic, right? And so there's the way that we continue to treat refugees, even when that's been kind of one of the corners, like one of the foundations of this country, and the way that we continue to hear portrayals of immigrants across the media, and then the way that Republicans sort of take that. I was part of this group of academics back in 2016 that initially said, with this rhetoric, Trump is not going to win. It seems like that rhetoric actually made him win. If we were to see a effective immigration reform, I continue to wonder whether that will cause another wave of response against that. I continue to wonder whether it's possible to make this shift in the minds of all Americans. It seems like we're against a tough challenge. But I don't want to close with that sort of sad note. So help me out here.
Well, I will point out one place that's been an exception to the story that we've been telling about the rise of nativism and right-wing parties, which is Germany, which accepted 1.2 million Syrian refugees. And it turns out the world didn't fall apart. In fact, the right-wing party's support declined. There was a surge in support initially, but it declined. There's a welcome culture built where millions of Germans participated in activities to help integrate newcomers. So it wasn't just a kind of abstract dialogue. People did very concrete things in their neighborhoods, in their local communities to welcome new people. And I think part of the reason that was able to occur is that Germany has been through a reckoning of a kind that we have not really been as a country. We are maybe going through it now or beginning it, but we have not gone through it. And our own history presents many, many models of change that's driven by the constituencies, the people who are on the other side of the oppression, people who are themselves oppressed, who galvanize energy and force a conversation. So the great asset we have in this country to combat this tide of authoritarianism is that we have a substantial and growing number of people of color who are energized politically, who are awakening through these social movements. And I think they will, with allies, power a next generation of reform. We are in a very ugly period now, but it is possible for us to get to a better and more just place. I have a lot of confidence in it. It's happening in the country, in states around the country, in Georgia and Arizona. Who would have thought that we would be where we are in terms of that beginning transformation? So that's not to underestimate how formidable the forces arrayed against progress are, but I do believe it is possible.
So maybe I'll think about this in two ways. So I would say don't give yourself so much credit, right? I think many people underestimated the power of white supremacy, quite frankly. And I think Donald Trump, coming on the heels of 8 years of Barack Obama, which for many people represented the end of an America that they knew and their greatest fear, in some ways, he sat in the middle of a very crowded field of other lackluster people, and he made people think, oh, this is interesting. He's had TV shows, he had a recognition. I mean, there were lots of things working for Donald Trump in 2016. But I think the main thing working for him was the power of white supremacy as an ideology. And I think as we connect it to the border, right? I mean, the reason we so strictly sort of control movement across our southern border in particular, and really only in this kind of way, is the border is central to who we are and who this country thinks it is. It is not just a maintenance of white supremacy tool. It is also the sort of marker of whiteness itself, right? And so to some extent, controlling that space, right, stemming that tide, to use that language, is a way to preserve a notion of this country that does not exist anymore, right? That has never existed, quite frankly. But in deed and action and foundational documents all the way down, you would believe America is a white man's country. I mean, that's what founders thought themselves. But the world looks a lot different in 2016 and 2021. So I think Donald Trump was just as much a sort of, he was in the right place at the right time. He was a benefactor of the moment. And I think, one of the things that people realize is that elections have consequences, and that we can never be too comfortable in the data we collect and all the things that we talk about, right, in determining victory. And I think it also made people remember once again how important, coming back to that census again, how important that census is, because the stage had been set for Donald Trump in 2010. The stage was set when, Red Map was like, let's look at this country and figure out what state legislatures we need to flip so that we can draw the lines and we can control the outcomes of elections in key states, because we know we can't win in a straight up and down match, which again, to Deepak's point about the filibuster, we can make the same point about the Electoral College and why that is still a thing, right? But the scene had been set for him. And if we're not careful again, we will see similar outcomes again, because it's not just all happening at the national level. The story here is a state story. It's a local story. So the story of national politics has to happen at the state level for the reasons that Deepak outlined. Look at Georgia, look at Arizona, look at Texas, look at California. These places are hugely important. And controlling state legislatures, particularly now, is going to be extremely important. Controlling gubernatorial seats, particularly now, is going to be extremely important. Florida matters, right? Georgia matters. And I think we have to realize we have to have a sort of all hands on deck, all state, all politics matter strategy, right? Because even for those of us who care about issues of racial justice, immigration, and criminal justice, and all the other things, environmental justice, that can only happen if we are paying attention to what's happening in our communities at the local and state level, so that we can get what we want at the national level.
Here's why I have hope. This moment of reckoning that we're in, I mean, I completely agree with Deepak that that we have a lot of work to do to just even understand where we've been, to understand where we need to go. And while I would never wish the events of these last few years, I never would have wished for them, they're also forcing a reckoning. The movement for Black Lives is forcing a reckoning. That people who maybe thought that the Black community was exaggerating about what happens at the hands of police have now seen it on film with their own eyes and find it undeniable, and that has forced a reckoning. The absolutely tragic events that we are seeing in attacks and harassment of the Asian American community, which it's escalated, but it is not new, is forcing a telling of the history of anti-Asian laws, anti-Asian violence, which goes back more than a century. The language and the actions of the last administration, taking people's children away from them, for example, without bothering even to keep track, has forced something of a reckoning. And even that, as horrible as it is not new. I mean, our history is replete with things of that level of ugliness. But what I take hope from is that those communities are also organizing, in some ways, are like the source of American redemption, right? The civil rights movement was about a grieved community insisting that the country live up to its values because it believed that the country could, which is extraordinary. And so while what we are reckoning with is incredibly serious and tragic, it is the pushing back that's happening is, I think, what redeems the country and ultimately can be the force that, that makes us the beacon to the world that we aspire to be, and and have a lot of work to do before we actually realize that vision of ourselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking us to that place of hope, and yet a challenging path, but there's hope, and I agree. And I want to thank the panelists. This was an absolute pleasure and honor. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone in the audience feels the same. Really complete privilege to have been here, sharing this space with you. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Margaret Lim now.
Hi everyone, my name is Margaret and I'm the Undergraduate Research Fellow for the Price Initiative. If you would like to learn more about Price, please visit priceinitiative.org. There you can see our future events, information about what Price is up to, and recordings of our past webinars. Also, feel free to follow us on Twitter at Price Initiative and sign up for our newsletter, which you can also do on our website. But wow, what an amazing discussion tonight. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists and moderator for an incredible conversation about immigration, racial justice, and public policy. And thank you to the audience for being a part of this conversation and coming this evening. So be on the lookout for more discussions hosted by Price, and have a great night, everyone.